History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 2, The First Civilizations, Chapter 2, Ancient Mesopotamia. Something like this explains the difference between southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd and 4th millennia BC and the other zones of Neolithic culture with which it had already been long in contact. The evidence of pottery and characteristic shrines shows that there were links between Mesopotamia and the Neolithic cultures of Anatolia, Assyria, and Iran. They all had much in common, but only in one relatively small area did a pattern of village life common to much of the Near East begin to grow faster and harden into something else. From that background emerges the first true urbanism, that of Sumer, and the first observable civilization. Sumer is an ancient name for southern Mesopotamia, which then extended about 100 miles less to the south than the present coast. The people who lived there may have been Caucasians, unlike their Semitic neighbors to the southwest and like their northern neighbors, the Elamites, who lived on the other side of the Tigris. Scholars are still divided about when Sumerians, that is, those who spoke the language later called Sumerian, arrived in the area. They may have been there since about 4000 BC, but since we know the population of civilized Sumer to be a mixture of races, perhaps including the earlier inhabitants of the region, with a culture which mixed foreign and local elements, it does not much matter. Sumerian civilization had deep roots. The people had long shared a way of life not very different from that of their neighbors. They lived in villages and had a few important cult centers, which were continuously occupied. One of these at a place called Iridu probably originated in about 5000 BC. It grew steadily well into historic times, and by the middle of the 4th millennium, there was a temple there, which some have thought to have provided the original model for Mesopotamian monumental architecture. Though nothing of that is now left but the platform on which it rested. Such cult centers began by serving those who lived near them. They were not true cities but places of devotion and pilgrimage. They may have had no considerable resident populations, but they were usually the centers around which cities later crystallized. And this helps to explain the close relationship region and government always had in ancient Mesopotamia. Well before 3000 BC, some such sites had very big temples indeed. At Uruk, which is called Erech in the Bible, there was a specially splendid one with elaborate decorations and impressive pillars of mud brick 8 feet in diameter. Pottery is among the most important evidence linking pre civilized Mesopotamia with historic times. It provides one of the first clues that something culturally important is going forward, which is qualitatively different from the evolutions of the Neolithic. The so called Uruk pots, the name is derived from the site where they were found, are often duller, less exciting than earlier ones. They are, in fact, mass produced, made in standard form on a wheel, which appears first in this role. The implication of this is strong that when they came to be produced, they already existed a population of specialized craftsmen. It must have been maintained by an agriculture sufficiently rich to produce a surplus exchange for their creation. It is with this change that the story of Sumerian civilization can conveniently be begun. It lasts about 1300 years, roughly from 3300 to 2000 BC, which is about as much time as separates us from the age of Charlemagne. At the beginning comes the invention of writing, possibly the only invention of comparable importance to the invention of agriculture before the age of steam. Most of it was done on clay for nearly half the time mankind had possessed the skill. Writing had in fact been preceded by the invention of cylinder seals, on which little pictures were incised to be rolled to the clay. Pottery may have degenerated, but these seals were one of the great Mesopotamian artistic achievements. The earliest writings followed in the form of pictograms and simplified pictures, a step towards non representative communication. On clay tablets, usually baked after they had been inscribed with a reed stalk. The earliest are in Sumerian, and it can be seen that they are memoranda, lists of goods, receipts. Their emphasis is economic and they cannot be read as continuously as prose. The writing on these early notebooks and ledgers evolved slowly towards cuneiform, a way of arranging impressions stamped on clay by the wedge like section of a chopped off reed. With this, the break with the pictogram form is complete. Signs and groups of signs came at this stage to stand for phonetic and possibly syllabic elements and are all made up of combinations of the same basic wedge shape. It was more flexible as a form of communication by signs that anything used hitherto, and Sumer reached it soon after 3000 BC. A fair amount is therefore known about Sumerian language. A few of its words have survived to this day. One of them is the original form of the word alcohol and the first recipe for beer, which is suggestive. But the language's greatest interest is its appearance in writing forms at all. Literacy must have been both unsettling and stabilizing. On one hand, it offered huge new possibilities of communicating. On the other hand, it stabilized practice because the consultation of a record as well as oral tradition became possible. It made much easier the complex operations of irrigating lands, harvesting, and storing crops, which were fundamental to a growing society. Writing made for more efficient exploitation of resources. It also immensely strengthened government and emphasized its links with the priestly castes who at first monopolized literacy. Interestingly, one of the earliest uses of seals appears to be connected with this, since they were used somehow to certify the size of crops at their receipt in the temple. Perhaps they record at first the operations of an economy of centralized redistribution, where men brought their due produce to the temple and received there the food or materials they themselves needed. Besides such records, the invention of writing opens more of the past to the historian in another way. He can at last begin to deal in hard currency when talking about mentality. This is because writing preserves literature. The oldest story in the world is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its most incomplete version, it is true, goes back only to the 7th century BC, but the tale itself appears in Sumerian times and is known to have been written down soon after 2000 BC. Gilgamesh was a real person ruling at Uruk. He became also the first individual and hero in the world literature, appearing in other poems too. His is the first name which must appear in this book. To a modern reader, the most striking part of the epic may be the coming of a great flood, which obliterates mankind except for a favored family who survive by building an ark. From them springs a new race to people to the world after the flood has subsided. This was not part of the epic's oldest version, but came from a separate poem telling a story which turns up in many Near Eastern forms, though its incorporation is easily understandable. Lower Mesopotamia must always have had much trouble with flooding, which would undoubtedly put a heavy strain on the fragile system of irrigation on which its prosperity depended. Floods were the type, perhaps, of general disaster and must have been helped to foster the pessimistic fatalism which some scholars have seen as the key to Sumerian religion. This somber mood dominates the epic. Gilgamesh does great things in his restless search to assert himself against the iron laws of the gods, which ensure human failure, but they triumph in the end. Gilgamesh too must die. The heroes, the wise men, like the new moon, have their waxing and waning. Men will say, who has ever ruled with might and with power like him? As in the dark month, the month of the shadows, so without him there is no light. O Gilgamesh, this was the meaning of your dream. You were giving the kingship. Such was your destiny. Everlasting life was not your destiny. Apart from this mood and its revelation of the religious temperament of a civilization, there is much information about the gods of the ancient Mesopotamia in the epic, but it is hard to get at history through it, let alone relate it to the historical Gilgamesh. In particular, attempts to identify a single cataclysmic flood by archaeological means have not been convincing, though plentiful evidence of recurrent flooding is available. From the water eventually emerges the land. Perhaps then, what we are being given is an account of the creation of the world, of Genesis. In the Hebrew Bible, earth emerges from the waters at God's will, and that account satisfied most educated Europeans for 1,000 years. It is fascinating to speculate that we may owe so much of our intellectual ancestry to a mythical reconstruction by the Sumerians of their own prehistory, when farming land had been created out of the morass of the Mesopotamian delta. But it is only speculation. Caution suggests we remain satisfied merely to note the undeniable close parallels between the epic and the one of the best Bible stories, that of Noah's Ark. This story hints at possible importance of the diffusion of Sumerian ideas in the Near East long after the focus of its history had moved away to Upper Mesopotamia. Versions and parts of the epic, to stick to that text alone for a moment, have turned up in the archives and relics of many peoples who dominated parts of this region in the second millennium BC, though later to be lost until rediscovery in the modern times. Gilgamesh was for 2000 years or so a name to which literature in many languages could knowingly refer, somewhat in the way that European authors could until recently take it for granted that an allusion to classical Greece would be understood by their readers. The Sumerian language lived on for centuries in temples and scribal schools, much as Latin lived on for the learned in the muddle of vernacular cultures in Europe after the collapse of the Western classical world of Rome. The comparison is suggestive because literary and linguistic tradition embodies ideas and images which impose, permit, and limit different ways of seeing the world. They have, that is to say, historic weight. Probably the most important ideas kept alive by the Sumerian language were religion. Cities like Ur and Uruk were the seed bank of ideas, which, after transmutation into other religions in the Near East during the first and the second millennia BC, were 4,000 years later to be influential worldwide, albeit in almost unrecognizably different forms. There is, for example, in the Gilgamesh epic, an ideal creature of nature, the man, Enkidu. His fall from his innocence is sexual, a seduction by a harlot, and thereafter, though the outcome for his is civilization, he loses his happy association with the natural world. Literature makes it possible to observe such hints at the mythologies of other and later societies. In literature, men begin to make explicit the meanings earlier hidden in obscure relics of sacrificial offerings, clay figurines, and the ground plans of shrines and temples. In the earliest Sumer, these already reveal an organization of human discourse with the supernatural, much more complex and elaborate than anything elsewhere at so early a date. Temples had been the focus of the early cities and they grew bigger and more splendid, in part because of a tradition of building new ones on mounds enclosing their predecessors. Sacrifices were offered in them to ensure good crops. Later, their cults elaborated. Temples of still greater magnificence were built as far north as Assur, 300 miles away up the Tigris. And we hear of one built with cedars brought from the Lebanon and copper from Anatolia. No other ancient society at that time gave religion quite so prominent a place or diverted so much of its collective resources to its support. It has been suggested that this was because no other ancient society left men feeling so utterly dependent on the will of the gods. Lower Mesopotamia in ancient times was a flat, monotonous landscape of mud flats, marsh, and water. There were no mountains for the gods to dwell in like men, only the empty heavens above, the remorseless summer sun, the overturning winds against which there was no protection, the irresistible power of flood water, the blighting attacks of drought. The gods dwelt in these elemental forces or in the high places which alone dominated the plains. The brick built towers and ziggurats, remembered in the biblical Tower of Babel. The Sumerians, not surprisingly, saw themselves as a people created to labor for the gods. By about 2250 BC, a pantheon of gods, more or less personifying the elements and natural forces, had emerged in Sumer. It was to provide the backbone of Mesopotamia, religion, and the beginning of theology. Originally, each city had its own particular god, possibly helped by political changes in relation of the cities. They were in the end organized into a kind of hierarchy, which both reflected and affected men's view of human society. The gods of Mesopotamia in the developed scheme are depicted in human form. To each of them was given a special activity or role. There was a god of air, another of water, another of plow. Ishtar, as she was later known under her Semitic name, was the goddess of love and procreation, but also of war. At the top of the hierarchy were three great male gods whose roles are not easy to disentangle: Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Anu was the father of the gods. Enlil was at first the most prominent. He was Lord Air, without whom nothing could be done. Enki, god of wisdom and of the sweet waters that literally meant life to Sumer, was a teacher and life giver who maintained the order of Enlil headship. These gods demanded propitiation and submission in elaborate rituals. In return for this and for living a good life, they would grant prosperity and length of days, but not more. In the midst of the uncertainties of Mesopotamian life, some feeling that a possible access to protection existed was essential. Men depended on the gods for reassurance in a capricious universe. The gods, though no Mesopotamian could have put it in these terms, were conceptualizations of elementary attempts to control environment, to resist the sudden disasters of flood and dust storms, to assure the continuation of the cycle of the seasons by the repetition of the great spring festival, when the gods were again married and the drama of creation was reenacted. After that, the world's existence was assured for another year. One of the great demands which men later came to make of religion was that it should help them to deal with the inevitable horror of death. The Sumerians and those who inherited their religious ideas can hardly have derived much comfort from their beliefs, insofar as we can apprehend them. They seem to have seen the world of life after death as a gloomy, sad place. It was the house where they sit in the darkness, where dust is their food and clay their meat. They are clothed like birds with wings for garments. Over bolt and door lie dust and silence. In it lies the origin of the later notion of Sheol, of hell. Yet, at least one ritual involved virtual suicide. For a Sumerian king and queen of the middle of the third millennium were followed to their tombs by their attendants who were then buried with them, perhaps after taking some soporific drink. This could suggest that the dead were going somewhere where a great retinue and gorgeous jewelry would be as important as on earth. There were important political aspects to Sumerian religion. All land belonged ultimately to the gods. The king, probably a king priest as much as a warrior leader in origin, was but their vicar. No human tribunal, of course, existed to call him to account. Vicariate also meant the emergence of a priestly class, specialists whose importance justified economic privilege, which could permit the cultivation of special skills and knowledge. In this respect, too, Sumer was the origin of a tradition, that of the seers, soothsayers, wise men of the East. They had also charge of the first organized system of education based on memorizing and copying in the uniform script. Among the byproducts of Sumerian religion were the first true likenesses of human beings in art. In particular, at one religious center, Mari, there seems to have been something of a fondness for portraying human figures engaged in ritual acts. Sometimes they are grouped in processions. Thus is established one of the great themes of pictorial art. Two others are also prominent: war and the animal world. Some have detected in the early portraiture of the Sumerians a deeper significance. They have seen in them the psychological qualities which made the astonishing achievements of their civilization possible, a drive for preeminence and success. This again is speculative. What we can also see for the first time in the Sumerian art is much of a daily life in earlier times hidden from us. Given the widespread contacts of Sumer and its basic similarity of structure to others, neighboring peoples, it is not too much to infer that we can begin to see something of life much as it was lived over a large area of ancient Near East. Seals, statuary, and paintings reveal a people often clad in a kind of fury, goatskin or sheepskin. Skirt the woman, sometimes throwing a fold of it over one shoulder. The men are often, but not always, clean shaven. Soldiers wear the same costumes and are only distinguishable because they carry weapons and sometimes wear a pointed leather cap. Luxury seems to have consisted in leisure and possessions other than dress, except for jewelry, of which qualities and quantities have survived. Its purpose often seems to be the indication of status and it symptomizes a society of growing complexity. There survives too a picture of drinking party. A group of men sit in armchairs with cups in their hands while a musician entertains them. At such moments, Sumer seems less remote. Sumerian marriage had much about it which would have been familiar to later societies. The crux of the matter was the consent of the bride's family. Once arranged to their satisfaction, a new monogamous family unit was established by the marriage, which was recorded in a sealed contract. Its head was the patriarchal husband who presided over both his relatives and his slaves. It is a pattern which was until very recently observable in most parts of the world. Yet there are interesting nuances. Legal and literary evidence suggests that even in early times, Sumerian women were less downtrodden than their sisters in many later Near Eastern societies. Semitic and non Semitic traditions may diverge in this. Sumerian stories of their gods suggest a society very conscious of the dangerous and even awe inspiring power of female sexuality. The Sumerians were the first people to write about passion. It is not easy to relate such things to institutions, but Sumerian law did not regard women as mere chattels, but gave them important rights. Even the slave mother of a free man's children had a certain protection at law. Divorce arrangements provided for women as well as men to seek separations and for the equitable treatment of divorced wives. Though a wife's adultery was punishable by death, while husband's was not. This difference is to be understood in the light of concern over inheritance and property. It was not until long after Sumerian times that Mesopotamian laws begins to emphasize on the importance of virginity and to impose the veil on respectable women. Both were signs of a hardening and more cramping role for them. The Sumerians also demonstrated great technical inventiveness. Other peoples would be much in their debt. The influence of the Sumerians' law can be traced well into post Sumerian times. Sumerians too laid the foundations of mathematics, establishing the technique of expressing number by position as well as by sign. As we, for example, can reckon the figure 1 as 1 tenth, 10, or several other values according to its relation to the decimal point. And they arrived at the method of dividing the circle into 6 equal segments. They knew about the decimal system too, though they did not exploit it, and we first encounter the 7-day week in the Gilgamesh epic. By the end of their history as an independent civilization, Sumerians had learned to live in brick groups. One city alone is said to have had 36,000 males. This made big demands on building skill, and even more were made by the large monumental structures. Lacking stone, southern Mesopotamians had first built in reeds plastered with mud, then with bricks made from mud and dried in the sun. Their brick technology was advanced enough by the end of the Sumerian period to make possible very large buildings with columns and terraces. The greatest of its monuments, the Ziggurat of Ur, had an upper stage over 100 feet high and a base 200 feet by 150. The earliest surviving potter's wheel was found at Ur. This was the first way in which man had use of rotary motion. On it rested the large scale production of pottery, which made it a man's trade and not, like earlier pottery, a woman's. Soon by 3000 BC, the wheel was being used for transport. Another invention of the Sumerians was glass, and specialized craftsmen were casting in bronze early in the 3rd millennium BC.